Hello everyone, so today I'm going to be talking about chapters 20 through 25 of To Kill a Mockingbird. So to give some brief context of how chapter 19 ended, it ended with Jim telling Scout to bring Dill outside since he had been crying to just kind of help calm him down. And so they go outside and then that's where they run into Mr. Raymond. So this is where chapter 20 kind of picks up. So chapter 20 begins with Dill and Scout talking to Mr. Raymond. Scout is at first pretty suspicious of Mr. Raymond and even calls him an evil man. Yet Dill is willing to trust him and accepts the offer and drinks from the paper sack. Dill then kind of smiles and realizes that the drink is only Coca-Cola. And Scout is really shocked by this news because it does not match his reputation of being a drunk. Mr. Raymond then kind of explains that the reason of why he pretends is because people would never truly understand the way he lives. And then after talking to Mr. Raymond for a while, Dill and Scout head back into the courthouse. By the time they returned, Mr. Gilmore had finished talking, and now it was Atticus who was speaking. And then Jim just kind of fills them in on what they missed, and is just super confident and assures Scout and Dill that Atticus is sure to win the case for Mr. Tom Robinson. Atticus addresses the jury in a very casual and detached tone. He explains that the trial is based on no solid medical evidence, just on two undependable witnesses. Atticus suggests that it was not Tom who beat Mayella, but actually Bob Ewell. And then he kind of provides his own version of what might have taken place during the assault. And then Atticus appeals to the jury, stating, "Our courts have their faults, as does any human institution, but in this country our courts are the great laborers, and in our courts all men are created equal." And then after finishing his few last remarks, in walks Calpurnia. So this is where chapter 21 begins. Atticus is handed a note stating that his children are missing. Mr. Underwood speaks up that they have been listening to the entire case, and then Atticus, being pretty exhausted, tells his children to head home. But Jim actually convinces him that they can return back to the case after supper. So Atticus agrees to this, and then they're able to return home, and Calpurnia is actually quite furious. I'm going to be reading from page 236, just her response. She says, "Calpurnia marched us home, saying, 'Skin every one of you alive. The very idea, you children, listening to all that. Mr. Jim, don't you know better than to take your sister to that trial? Miss Alexandra absolutely have a stroke of paralysis when she finds out ain't fitting for her children to hear.'" And then Calpurnia's pretty accurate because Aunt Alexandra is indeed very shocked and almost nearly faints. But then after enjoying supper, Jim and Scout return back to the courthouse. And this is where Reverend Sykes informs them of what they missed. He explains Mr. Gilmore talks some more, and the jury has gone for about half an hour discussing whether to convict Tom Robinson of being guilty or not. So Jim is still very confident and very much assured that his father has got this case and that they're going to win. And then Scout just kind of explains that the courtroom is just very still and that they're just waiting and waiting for a response. And so I'm going to be reading from page 239 through 240 of just how she describes the atmosphere in the courthouse. She says, but I must have been reasonably awake, or I would not have received the impression that was creeping into me. It was not unlike one I had last winter. I shivered through the night. It was hot. The feeling grew until the atmosphere in the courtroom was exactly the same as a cold February morning, when the mockingbirds were still and the carpenters had stopped hammering on Mrs. Mowdy's new house. Every wood door in the neighborhood was shut as tight as the doors of the Radley place. So she kind of explains that even though it was like a hot summer day, it kind of felt like a cold winter evening, just sending chills down her spine, just anticipating what the answer is going to be. So then after lots of waiting, the jury walks in, and they don't look towards Tom Robinson. And then Judge Taylor makes the announcement that the jury does declare Tom guilty, and this is where Atticus then gets up and leaves. So chapter 22 begins with them kind of walking home and then heading back, and Jim just cries and is just very upset by this news and just says, like, it isn't right at all. And yeah, he's just very furious of the outcome of the case. And then Atticus is just super tired and exhausted, so he heads to bed. However, in the morning, things are better, and Atticus just kind of reassures his children that they have no need to worry and that things can still go right and still work out. And then also, the family is surprised by a great feast from Tom Robinson's father and the community, who all brought food for the Finch family, so they could have this like grand feast for breakfast, and such as like pork and rolls and beans. So they're just really surprised by just the generosity. And Atticus actually proceeds to leave, but then Dill comes back and visits and explains what Mrs. Rachel's reaction was to him attending the case. And then all three children then go out to the front porch where they run into Miss Stephanie, who then kind of questions why in the world they were at that courthouse and just kind of scolds them and just kind of says, like, you shouldn't have done that. Then Miss Melody also visits and talks to them, but she kind of treats it more like a normal day, and she's just a lot more understanding and more empathetic to the children, and she just kind of assures Jim that there still are decent people in Maycomb, and she actually kind of reminds them that this case is like a step towards Maycomb being a more progressive town, and that although it's not perfect, that they're at least taking that next step to being more progressive. And so the chapter ends with Miss Stephanie actually announcing to the children that Bob Ewell just spat in Atticus's face. Oops. And then chapter 23 picks up with Atticus's response to Bob Ewell. So despite Ewell's aggressive behavior towards Atticus, Atticus is not worried and does not fight back. In fact, he just kind of says, I wish Ewell wouldn't chew tobacco so much, and he's just not willing to fight, and he just kind of walks away and doesn't really do anything or fight back. And Jim and Scout are just really concerned for their father, just his safety and just the fact that Ewell might come back and attack him. But he just kind of reassures his children that he understands why Ewell wanted to fight him and wanted to spit in his face, and saying that he understands because he kind of embarrassed him in court a little bit. And it kind of destroyed his reputation. So he's just super understanding and sets such a great example for his children. And then he also assures his children that the higher court would review Tom's case and that he might be freed after all. So then Jim and Atticus discuss what should happen when a man is guilty of rape charges. So it's a pretty serious conversation, and then they kind of switch to the topic of juries. Jim really questions the jury process and if it's actually beneficial or if it is actually hurtful. And he kind of says that they should just get rid of the jury system altogether. And then Atticus kind of surprises Jim and Scout by saying that the jury is a good thing, and that, in fact, there was actually one man in the jury who thought Tom was innocent at first. And so they're like, who is it? And so then it turns out that that one man was Mr. Cunningham. Now you might be thinking, what made Mr. Cunningham change his mind? And they kind of talk about how that night at the jail, how when they were about to attack Atticus, but then Jim and Scout go and kind of, help rescue Atticus a little bit. That kind of really got Mr. Cunningham rethinking things, and it kind of changed his mindset a little bit. So Scout wants to invite young Walter Cunningham just to kind of show her appreciation, and so she wants to invite him over one day for dinner, but Aunt Alexandra actually forbids this. She says that they are not kin, and she actually then goes and calls the Cunninghams trash, which is really unfortunate. And then Jim and Scout then later discuss the different types of people in the world. Jim starts by saying that there are like 4 different types, and then Scout's just like, no, there's only one type. And then Jim kind of says, I used to think like that, but that's kind of more of a naive answer, and like, why do people argue? And Scout just kind of says, I think there's just one kind of folks. Then chapter 24, we get kind of a different scene with Aunt Alexandra hosting her missionary circle at the Finch's house. And then you just kind of have Scout helping serve refreshments and just kind of talking with the ladies. And unfortunately, she kind of gets asked questions that are meant kind of to embarrass her. And so she's not a huge fan of ladies in the missionary circle. And she actually says she prefers her father's world because she feels like men didn't make fun of her and they weren't highly critical of her, or ask her embarrassing questions meant to make fun of her. So she just says she likes men a little bit better. And then Atticus arrives home early, which is kind of a shock. And so Aunt Alexandra, Miss Melody, and Scout all enter into the kitchen, and that's when they find out the unfortunate news when Atticus explains that Tom is dead. He says he was shot while trying to climb the prison fence to escape. And then Calpurnia goes to leave to help Helen, who is Tom's wife, and Miss Melody, Scott, and Aunt Alexandra return to the mission circle, pretending like nothing happened. Then chapter 25, it's a fairly short chapter, and it begins with Scout going to kill a roly-poly, but Jim stops her, and Scout claims that Jim is getting more like a girl, and that he's going through like a phase. But then Jim told her about his visit with Atticus and Dill to Helen Robinson's house, and where Helen actually faints before Atticus even has a chance to tell her that her husband has died. And then the news of Tom's death has kind of gone over through Maycomb, and the community just kind of discussing Tom's death, saying many people think it was typical for a black man to do this and that they're not surprised. And it's unfortunately very more of a negative view of this. However, we do get an editorial from Mr. Underwood, who writes proclaiming that Tom was in fact innocent and that he was murdered. So yes, that. Oh, and sorry. And then I have one last quote, which says from Scout, which says, "Tom was a dead man. The minute Mayella Ewell opened her mouth and screamed." So that was my presentation for To Kill a Mockingbird, chapters 20 through 25.